If you had done this and you can act the way you do now, you're the most diabolical criminal that's ever walked the face of the earth. And I guess that was a compliment. But in fact, they felt I had killed John Bonet. That was their decision on probably within 24 hours before any evidence or any information came in from the forensic group and so forth. If that was not acting right, then I'm sorry, but that's the perspective I was coming at.
A suspect the entire police department concluded was guilty within the first 24 hours, before any evidence existed. Today, that same man tells the story himself, exactly the way he wants it told. We're dissecting every layer of that account. I'm Marcus Wren, the creator of the Tell Index, a 50-signal framework for analyzing statements and behavior in criminal cases. This is my second video on the John Ramsey case. Hit subscribe if you want to follow this entire analysis series. Today's footage doesn't come from a news outlet. It comes from an online panel discussion hosted by the Cold Case Foundation. This is a nonprofit bringing together more than 200 investigative experts worldwide, and one thing needs to be said clearly up front. This organization had already been working closely with the Ramsey family for nearly a year before this panel took place. This is not a neutral press interview. It's a conversation between people who were already on the same side. Leading this segment is Greg Cooper, former acting chief of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, who had once served as the direct assistant to John Douglas, the legendary criminal profiler. It's Greg who recounts how Douglas was invited to meet the Ramsey family back in 1997, before handing the floor to John Ramsey to describe that experience from his own perspective. 30 years after the case, this is a rare instance of John Ramsey explaining, in detail, the very day he became suspect number one, not because of evidence, but because of how he reacted in the first few hours. We're going to hear, word for word, how he tells that story, and we're stopping 4 times.
Greg, tell the audience how you got involved in this and back in the day. While John is, and now you need to unmute. Sorry.
Okay.
Yep, you're good now.
Okay, so back in 96, I guess it was about 96, at the time, I had left the FBI and went on to become a police chief. And I had been working with John Douglas on a conference that we had put together in Salt Lake City. And we were talking about, within that conference, talking about profiling generally. It was about a 3-day criminal investigative analysis conference. And after we had completed the conference, John was in my office, and he had received a phone call from one of the attorneys, from John Ramsey's attorney, inviting him to come out to the Ramseys and spend some time with the attorneys and whoever else wanted to talk with him with respect to the details of this case. And I recall that John and I had quite a discussion. His response to the attorney, as I recall it, was, you may not want me to come out there and talk to you. You may not like my answers. Because at the time, we all have a tendency to go back to that which we are comfortable with and what our experience has been. And typically, those things that were of concern, John had mentioned as during our discussion, that there was a circle, if you will, of potential people of interest that naturally fall within an area of consideration. And which the first circle, or tier, which is what I like to refer to it as, is the family, particularly for certain characteristics of this type of crime, mostly not having to do with the behavioral aspects of this crime, but rather the crime scene, the location of it, and the environment, and some of the circumstances and situation. And our discussion centered around that. And So I took John out to the airport, dropped him off, which he was supposed to go home, but instead he had changed his flight plans to go out there to Boulder and visit with John Ramsey and his legal team and review the case. So that was my first exposure to this case.
Greg Cooper opens with background. In 1997, right after a criminal profiling conference in Salt Lake City, John Douglas received a call from John Ramsey's attorney inviting him to Boulder. According to Greg's account, Douglas's first response to the attorney was a blunt warning they might not like his answers. Douglas then changed his flight plans, skipping his trip home to fly straight to meet the Ramsey family.
So we got to know John, and over the next year or two, I guess, really, he testified. When the grand jury was called, ultimately, and several years later, he testified to the grand jury.
Stop right here. John Ramsey says that after a long stretch of conversation, the thing he remembers most about Douglas is a single line. If he had really done this and could still act the way he does now, he'd be the most diabolical criminal that's ever walked the face of the earth. And immediately after, John Ramsey adds, he guesses that was a compliment. This is what's notable from a language standpoint, not Douglas's line itself, but the way John Ramsey chooses to hold on to it and retell it. A hypothetical description of being the most depraved killer on the planet, reframed as a compliment, and told with enough ease to become an amusing anecdote at a public panel discussion nearly 30 years later. By the Tell Index detection criteria, leakage isn't about the content of the story, it's about an extreme phrase, one that should logically cause discomfort, being selected for retelling and reframed in a positive direction. A word choice that isn't entirely natural for the context. It needs to be said immediately. This is the weakest type of signal in the whole system, worth flagging as a point of interest only, not evidence, and it should never stand alone. He also mentions that Douglas later testified before the grand jury, and that the grand jury wasn't very kind to him, a detail offered as evidence that the justice system was harsh even toward the very person defending the Ramsey family, further reinforcing the narrative that the family was treated unfairly.
Yeah.
And John was the first, to my knowledge, the first expert to assess it as a profiler and make the determination or opinion, give the opinion that this was not a family crime that had occurred.
Mm-hmm.
And he was convinced that it was nobody within the family that was responsible for it.
Greg Cooper confirms it again. To his knowledge, Douglas was the first criminal profiling expert to formally conclude that this was not a crime committed by someone within the family. A complete reversal of Greg's own initial expectation. That attention would focus on the family first.
In fact, they felt I had killed John Bonet. That was their decision on probably within 24 hours before any evidence or any information came in from the forensic group and so forth, because I didn't act right. And that assessment was made by somebody who really hadn't had the experience in dealing with homicides or...
Stop here for the second time. John Ramsey says the police decided literally on day one, within 24 hours, before any forensic evidence or information came in, that he was the one who killed John Bonet, simply because he didn't act right. He describes whoever made that assessment as someone without real experience handling homicides or that kind of kidnapping situation. This is Code D5, attacking the competence of the investigator, instead of directly engaging with the specific behavioral details that have already been publicly documented. And this is where the case file gets genuinely interesting. The first detective on scene that morning, Linda Arndt, has publicly confirmed in multiple interviews that she was certain she knew who the killer was, based on a specific sequence of behavioral observations throughout that morning. John Ramsey calmly reading his mail while the family waited for a ransom call. No reaction at all when the 10 o'clock deadline the kidnapper had set passed in silence, and, in particular, A wordless exchange of glances between the two of them the moment he carried his daughter's body up from the basement. In other words, the basis for the initial suspicion wasn't vague or purely a gut feeling, the way John Ramsey describes it. It was a specific list of behaviors, named repeatedly and publicly by that very detective. By bundling that entire list into a vague phrase like "didn't act right" and calling the person who made that assessment inexperienced, he avoids directly responding to any of the specific details already on the public record. Exactly the same pattern we saw in the previous video, when he called an entire 13-month investigative phase something that never actually investigated.
My oldest daughter had been killed 4 years before John Bonet died in a car accident. I got a call at the middle of the day from my brother. Beth was in a car accident and she's gone. And of course, I was devastated beyond words, but I couldn't do anything. I couldn't help her. I couldn't get her to a good doctor. It was over. No alternative. No way I could help her. John Bonet wasn't over that morning. I really thought I could get her back if I kept my wits about me. And so that's what was driving me. I'm going to get her back. I could do something. I just got to be sure I do everything I possibly can and do it right to get John Bonet back.
This is the second time we've caught this exact repeating pattern. Stop here for the third time. John Ramsey explains why he didn't react the way a father might be expected to. 4 years earlier, his oldest daughter, Beth, had died in a car accident, and at that time, he knew it was over, no way to save her. But that morning with John Bonet, he believed he still had a chance, so he chose to stay calm instead of crying in a corner, because he believed that only by keeping his composure could he bring his daughter back. This is a coherent, logical, deeply persuasive explanation. But what's notable isn't the content, it's that this isn't the first time this story has been told. In a 2013 interview with CBN, he recounted the call from his brother about Beth's death in almost identical detail. In a 2024 interview with 9 News, he repeated the exact same comparative structure. Losing Beth meant there was nothing left to do, while that morning with John Bonet, he still had hope of saving her. People magazine also recorded him using this same comparative framework in another interview. 3 times, years apart, across 3 different media outlets, with the same argumentative structure, the same sequence of details. By the Tell Index detection criteria, a genuinely traumatic memory retold multiple times usually carries small variations, random details that appear or disappear over time. A story that maintains an almost identical structure across many years and many different contexts carries the hallmark of a story that has been told and retold until it became a fixed template, more than a memory being naturally retrieved fresh each time it's asked about.
If the so-called detective that was there that morning expected me to be crying in the corner, beating my head on the wall, that wasn't going to get it done. I wanted to get my daughter back, and I thought I could if I really kept my wits about me. So if that was not acting right, then I'm sorry, but that's the perspective I was coming at.
And here's a moment that's entirely separate, even though it's only seconds away from round 3 in the same breath. He imagines what the detective on scene that day probably expected of him. Crying in a corner, beating his head against the wall, then declares that wouldn't have accomplished anything, he just wanted to bring his daughter back. And he closes with a sentence built on a very particular structure. If that was considered not acting right, then I'm sorry. This is no longer a story being told. It's an entirely different rhetorical act, a conditional apology. He doesn't say I'm sorry for shocking you. He places the entire apology inside an if clause. If you consider that to have been wrong, then I'm sorry, but I myself still don't concede that it was wrong. This is exactly the kind of hedging code A6 describes, a phrase that sounds like a concession but concedes nothing specific, leaving him a perfect exit if anyone later tries to use this very statement to force him to admit he acted wrongly. It needs to be said clearly here, and only once in this entire video. Retelling a personal story with the same structure over many years is entirely normal for anyone who has had to process a major loss and recount it publicly dozens of times. This is a natural psychological mechanism that helps a person create coherence out of a chaotic experience. It doesn't mean the story is fabricated. The conditional apology at the end is also a very human reflex when someone has been placed on the defensive for decades. Not necessarily a deliberate calculation. John Ramsey was officially cleared by police through DNA back in 2008. What we've just dissected is how an explanation was constructed and maintained over time, not a conclusion about who killed John Bonet. This is the second time in this video series we've caught the exact same pattern. When asked about something specific, he consistently answers with a more general concept instead. Do you think that's a coincidence or a communication habit honed over 30 years of facing the media? Leave a comment below, I read everyone, and hit subscribe, because the next installment of this series takes us inside the house itself, where the crime happened, minute by minute, door by door.